Well, welcome to Earthwood Baptist Church House Group Online. Today we're going to carry on looking through the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to look at the second half of chapter 8. This is really the centre, absolute centre of Mark's Gospel. Here we have Peter's confession of faith in Jesus as Messiah, and, if you like, the upward trajectory of Jesus' ministry begins to turn. His teaching takes a darker turn as he himself turns towards Jerusalem and recognizes the coming cross. Our reading is Mark chapter 8 through to 9 verse 1. This is one of the bits in the Bible where the man who split up the chapters didn't quite get it right.
They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spat on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village." Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." And he said to them, "Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see that the kingdom of God has come with power."
As we look at the second half of chapter 8, first we come across yet another healing. And it's rather similar to the last one we looked at, in that Jesus uses spittle to be part of that healing process as a visual aid and perhaps an aid to the process. Not something, again, that health and safety might allow in these hard times. But also interesting here, I think, is the way that the man partially receives his sight, and then Jesus has to pray for him again. And that's an encouragement to us who sometimes have to pray on, and hopefully sometime in the future we will see some healing. It's not always an instant process. But I think really what Mark is trying to bring out here are the spiritual parallels between this man, this blind man, and the disciples and the people in the crowds around. Because Jesus takes the blind man outside the village to heal him, and Jesus takes the disciples away from the crowds. I think in both cases it's a matter of perhaps taking them away from unbelieving situations to somewhere where faith can be exercised. And the blind man receives his sight, and the blind disciples receive their insight, or at least a partial insight, a bit like the blind man's healing. So we come to Peter's great confession of faith, a great moment of insight where he recognizes that Jesus is the Messiah, which is the Hebrew word for the Greek Christ. They're the same word. But one might say here that he's not actually saying Jesus is the second part of the Trinity, that he's not God. That comes later in Mark's Gospel as the death and resurrection of Jesus show who he really is. At this stage, I think this is largely a political statement. Peter might have recognized that Jesus wasn't the military Messiah that they'd all been hoping for, but he didn't see him as God's son in that sense. So, like the blind man, Peter's insight is partial, and that's patently obvious when Jesus starts teaching about his death and what's going to come in the future, and Peter tries to stop him and gets a very strong rebuke. Jesus is teaching there about a real cost in discipleship, and he rebukes Peter very strongly for his lack of understanding, even at this stage where he's only just begun to teach about the subject. And we have to ask ourselves, what's our insight about following Jesus? Which Peter are we? Are we the one who recognizes the Messiah, or the one who tries to tell the Messiah what he ought to do? Because there's a real cost to following Jesus, isn't there? Peter can't cope with the thought that Jesus will go on to die, which was perhaps understandable at the time, because it was a clear sign that someone wasn't the Messiah when they died on a cross or otherwise. There were plenty of false messiahs who'd come and gone, and no one really remembered them. We too need to be reminded of the cost of following Jesus, that it will involve serving, suffering, perhaps even death. And in a materialistic world, all this needs to be heard, doesn't it? That victory for Jesus came on the cross. Success and power in the kingdom is different from that in the world. It's not what you can attain, what you can earn, what you can get for yourself in material terms. It's a spiritual thing, and it's a cost that comes through taking up our cross daily and following Jesus in all the ways that Jesus went. Well, of course, that last verse does raise the question, did Jesus actually get it wrong here? How does the kingdom come in power in just a few years' time, in the generation, while the people around him are still alive? Some would actually sort of interpret this as Jesus being totally human, and therefore he got things wrong. But I don't think that's right. I think this verse isn't talking at all about the second coming of Jesus and his return in power in that sense, because he's already said in Mark's Gospel and other Gospels that the kingdom of God is already here or near or amongst you. The kingdom is actually here. And the kingdom is fully established as evil is defeated on the cross. And surely the kingdom itself comes in power at Pentecost. I don't know whether you see this verse like that, but I think it makes a whole lot of sense, and it shows that Jesus was being quite accurate in what he was saying. So what are our thoughts for the day? A couple of quotes really. G.K. Chesterton wrote, "The Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried." Perhaps many of us, me included, or perhaps me primarily, would say that sometimes that following Jesus is just too difficult and too challenging. And Mark Twain famously wrote, "It ain't those parts of the Bible that I can't understand that bother me. It's the parts that I do understand." Isn't that so true about us, me, Christians in general, that we're very happy to argue about the difficult bits of Jesus' teaching and wonder whether he got things right. But we find it so difficult just to obey the bits that are perfectly straightforward, maybe loving our neighbour, that are perfectly clear, and we ought to just get on and do it. And I, for one, may need to apply these quotes to this chapter. Well, I hope that gives us something to think about at home or in house group on Zoom. And not sure what we're going to do next time. We may carry on with another chapter of Mark, or we may do something completely different. But I hope to see you there.